as we get later into the week, as always, we talk about the latest in the business and economic sector, and who better to join us to talk about these many different topics affecting us here in Michigan and across the U.S. and throughout the globe than Dr. Michael Greiner, Assistant Professor of Management in Oakland University's School of Business Administration. Dr. Greiner, thanks for joining us again this week.
It's great to be here, Tyler. Greetings from England, where I'm participating in an international conference right now.
Well, cheerio to you, Dr. Greiner, for joining us all the way from across the pond. And with that, let's begin with some of the struggles that are happening on the European side of the economy, given the very similar effects that they're seeing that we have been here in the United States. The effects of inflation really taking a toll in Europe, in particular when it comes to consumer consumption of goods and services. So how is that really affecting them and leading them into what looks like it could potentially be a recession?
Yeah, in fact, actually, what the data seems to indicate right now is Germany is actually in a recession right now. And of course, Germany is the largest economy in Europe. So as a result of it, Germany going into recession means that the rest of Europe pretty much goes into recession. There's also been some weaknesses as well in Ireland and in Finland. But it's kind of ironic that you're actually seeing growth in a couple places like France, for example, and Spain. But Germany is such a big economy that it getting into trouble just brings down the whole European economy. And really the cause of it, as you pointed out, is inflation, where people are not spending as much money as they had been on goods, and they're kind of holding on to their money. They don't have the amount of savings. There wasn't the amount of support that happened as a result of the COVID pandemic here as there was in the United States. And as a result of that, people really don't have money, and they feel that they need to hold on to it to basically deal with all the issues that they've got. What's more is that given the, I guess, disruption that they're feeling as a result of the war next door in Ukraine, they're feeling that they really need to be careful with their money right now. And as a result, they're not spending the way they are. I mean, one of the big supports in the U.S. economy has been consumer spending, and they just aren't seeing that in Germany right now, which is big trouble for the German economy.
So in terms of action from the government or from governments in Europe, it's very different than our U.S. economy, where we have a large mass of land. We got 50 states that have their own individual economies, some larger than others, some larger than some other nations across the world that are managing their economy, while the federal government manages the overall economy of the entire union and its territories and other properties. It's very different, but also somewhat similar in Europe, where the European Union has some hold over the economic powers and economic regulations, and those individual countries do too. So what is happening in Europe to address inflation, maybe similarly to what we're doing in the U.S. or differently, and why is it having so much greater of an effect on Europeans than it is here in America?
Yeah, that's kind of amazing right now. And, you mentioned about the fact that Europe is kind of like the United States, where they're trying to develop a federal system, very much like what we have ourselves. And you're right about that. I mean, the fact is that they are trying to essentially turn into a United States of Europe. And that's kind of where Britain didn't want to be part of it, where I am right now, and they went through the whole Brexit fiasco. And that's largely because of the fact that they didn't want to kind of give up some of their sovereignty to the central government in Brussels. But one thing that they do have in Brussels is that they've got an excellent central bank. And that central bank that's headed by Mario Draghi has been aggressive in essentially raising interest rates to deal with inflation, very much like what we've done in the United States. But again, unlike in the United States, they didn't have as much government support during the pandemic, and as a result, people didn't have the savings that they had here in there in the United States, and they don't have then the purchasing power right now that's able to kind of get them through this crisis the way that we do in the United States. It's a big surprise that we're constantly getting these good figures about how strong the economy is in the United States. And that's really a credit to the fact that both political parties made a big investment in the United States workers during that pandemic to make sure that, we actually went through a period of growth as we're coming out of this pandemic, and recovered very quickly, with jobs coming back very quickly, much in contrast to what happened after the 2008-2009 recession, and really also in contrast to what's happening in Europe right now.
And it all comes back for us here in Michigan or in the United States. We're looking at Europe, and many may be even watching this and thinking, well, how the hell does that apply to us in the United States? That's Europe. That's their problems. That's not going to come back and trickle down in the U.S. at all. But we have a lot of major partnerships in Europe, and them going into a recession, whether it's across Europe or in certain countries, like you mentioned, Germany, that could have a big effect on our economy as we continue to push for some sort of relief, some sort of recovery during this current economic crisis.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. In Germany in particular, I mean, you have to remember with Michigan's auto-focused economy, Germany is really a big partner for us. A lot of the auto manufacturing that goes on in Europe is done in Germany. And as a result, we have these great partnerships between the United States and German companies where they are investing here in the United States and we're investing in Germany. And essentially you have this flow back and forth. And if those companies aren't doing so well, then they won't be investing back in the United States and in Michigan the way that we'd hope. It's especially interesting right now, and I'm sure this is a topic we'll get to later, but this is especially critical at a time when the United States is really kind of decoupling from China, where you're not seeing as much trade between the United States and China, and really a lot of that gap now is being made up for by trade with Europe, in particular with Germany. And the fact that the German economy is slowing down the way it is something that really we all need to be concerned about, even in Michigan.
Joining us on today's program is Dr. Michael Greiner, Assistant Professor of Management at Oakland University's School of Business Administration, as he does each and every week to talk about the latest in the business and economic news here in Oakland County, across the state of Michigan, and throughout the U.S. and around the world. The big story on the economic side in the state of Michigan is a look from leaders in Lansing about what to do about Michigan's dwindling population. We know that this is, of course, going to affect a number of different sectors in the state of Michigan as population continues to dwindle, and those who are in these industries continue to be older and older individuals who are eventually going to retire. But in terms of policy making, how can our population be affected by policy in Lansing? How may that be addressed from leadership?
Yeah, this is actually a very big issue. And you have to remember, I mean, just to kind of step back for a second, the way that you calculate the output of an economy, whether it be the national economy or the state's economy, is basically the number of people working multiplied by the amount of economic activity that they're producing. So if you have fewer people producing output, then obviously the economy is not going to grow the way that you want it to. And that becomes a particular issue, as you point out, when you have so many people retiring. As it is, as a result of COVID, we had a lot of workers who kind of moved from the workforce into retirement, where they decide, hey, I'm off, I don't necessarily want to go back to working. And you've seen actually the total size of the workforce go down a little bit as a result of people essentially deciding that they want to retire rather than continuing working. And that's a problem, because the fact that then you've got fewer people working, paying taxes, and as we know, older people tend to be people who are very expensive for the state. They're the ones who the state ends up putting a lot of money into in terms of Medicare, in terms of Medicaid, in terms of support services and that type of thing. All those things are paid for through taxes by the people who are still working. So if you have fewer people working and more retirees, you can see that you start to get an imbalance. So the state has identified this as a really critical problem. And actually, the Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist has focused on this as one of his major missions. And up in Mackinac, I understand the governor herself was talking about this fact that we need to really prioritize attracting young people, especially to the state of Michigan. And, I think this goes back to something else that we've talked about before, which is immigration has to be critical. If there's anything that has been sustaining the Michigan population, because you have to remember, right now we are number 50 in the entire country, the lowest in terms of growth in population of the entire country. And the only thing that's keeping us going really is immigration. So by encouraging people to come here, both from other parts of the country and other parts of the world, then those end up being the workers who end up producing the economic output and paying the taxes that really make it possible for our state's economy to be able to grow and for us to be able to support the people who are now retirees.
And an interesting factor in this too is, excuse me, you so often hear about in these sort of situations from usually those on the conservative side of the political aisle about supporting job creators, about making the economic environment more friendly to the businesses themselves so that they can theoretically up the pay scale, up the number of benefits or the quality of benefits that they're offering to workers, and therefore attract people into the state. Not often you're hearing that kind of rhetoric from a Democratic executive, let alone those in power in both the executive and the legislative branch in the state of Michigan. So on that side of things, how made this Democratic administration and its friends in the legislature ultimately adjust their economic policy to maybe make it more business friendly too? So these businesses are also going to pull people in, because in the past there have been articles that have been posted. We've talked about it right here on the Megacast too, that immigration can be a helpful factor in this, but it's not necessarily going to be enough to really bridge those gaps between Michigan's falling population, despite it already being currently the overall state still one of the largest in the union.
Yeah, you're right. And there is, I think at this point, they're kind of in a research phase. There's supposedly a bipartisan report that's being put together by the lieutenant governor along with some Republican colleagues. And the effort is really to identify those action items that the state is able to take. But you're right. I mean, fundamentally, we do need to kind of create this environment that's favorable to business. I mean, one thing I think that was particularly shocking to me as I was looking through the data is one of the big cities to see a drop in population was Ann Arbor. And Ann Arbor, you would typically think of as the kind of city that would be attracting young people from across the country, with the strong presence of the University of Michigan there and really the vibrant downtown that they've got. And everything that we've been seeing happening in Detroit as well, with the all the revitalization in the downtown area there, you would have thought that would also have been attracting people. But yet Detroit also saw a big decline in population. So my concern is that young people are deciding that this isn't really a place that they want to come to kind of settle down and make their roots. And my hope is that the lieutenant governor and his task force will be able to identify some action items that really will make this a more attractive place for young people to be able to come and settle and raise their families.
Joining us on today's edition of the Megacast is Dr. Michael Greiner from Oakland University, who joins us each and every week on Friday to talk about the latest in business and economic news here in Oakland County, across the state of Michigan, and throughout the U.S. and around the world as well. Dr. Greiner, right here in Oakland County, local residents may have a chance to address some title problems on their homes. There could be a number of different issues that could come up and affect somebody's title that they have on their house, including but not limited to certain scams that they may ultimately have put that title into question. But there are legal steps that are being put in place and that are being addressed by the county itself for homeowners. What are some of these different steps that are being put in place to help owners address problems that they may just have found out about now with the title of their home that maybe perhaps could have been problems for a long time?
Yeah, I'll tell you, as an attorney who was formerly in practice and who actually dealt with cases like this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. The thing that we forget sometimes is that property is really a concept. I have to kind of explain this to my students sometimes. It's a very American concept, actually, the idea that property can be controlled by somebody to the point where the state can't even come in and take it. The government can't come in and take your property. In most countries, if the government decides they want your property, they just come and take it. That can't happen in the United States. And so we take a very strong view of our property rights, and we forget about the fact that if there is some kind of what's called a cloud of title, where there's some question as to where someone else might have a property interest in this property in one way, shape, or form, then that can have an impact on the ability of that person to be able to sell their property in the future, or to be able to, for example, get a mortgage that they can use then to do things like make home improvements and that type of thing. We forget that most of the wealth that most Americans have is tied up in their homes. And so the fact that these people suddenly aren't able to access the wealth that they have in their own homes is something that should be a big concern to all of us. So I'm kind of excited about this effort. It's by the County of Oakland and the Oakland County Bar Association. And they've made a commitment to be able to essentially give free legal help to people who found that there is some question over the title to their property. There are steps that can be taken. Essentially, you have to go to court, and you can get a court ruling, which in what's called a quiet title action, where the judge will essentially look at the evidence and find that, oh, this person actually owns the property, and then that clarifies any issues out there. But so much of the time, people don't know how to do that, and that has led to people abandoning property, which they might otherwise have redeveloped and invested in, and made into a vital part of the community. And so I think that this is really an important effort to try to make sure that people are able to get the full value out of their property and really improve our communities overall.
We're joined today, as we all are each and every week, for our weekly business and economics segment with Dr. Michael Greiner from Oakland University's School of Business Administration. You can find all these segments on demand on our website, civiccentertv.com/megacast, and you'll also find more information on Oakland University programs at oakland.edu. Dr. Greiner, finally today, some good news on the economic relationship between the United States and China, as some improvements have been made, or at least metrics are showing some improvements have been made between imports and exports from the American economy to the Chinese economy and vice versa, putting America on a very slightly more even playing field with China. Not majorly, but on a very slightly more even playing field. Tell us about that dynamic. What has changed of late between this major economy here in the U.S. and that major economy in China?
Yeah, you're right. And, we did kind of touch on it earlier, but basically we have to remember the United States and China right now are the #1 and #2 largest economies in the world. And so when you're dealing with trade between these two countries, you're dealing with major issues that affect the global economy as well as the economies right here in Michigan and across the country. And and what we've seen actually is the biggest drop in the share of the imports that come into the United States from China for really decades that we've seen. That number has been growing for some time, and actually it's gone down. And that probably has something to do with a number of factors. I mean, there's been the concern that really became evident as a result of the COVID pandemic that our supply chains weren't really safe globally, and that relying upon countries as far away and really sometimes as unreliable as partner as China is, can be really something that ends up leading to problems ourselves. I mean, that's where we got to some of this inflation problem, is the fact that we had those supply chain disruptions, which ended up leading to the kind of the mismatch between the supply of goods that we had and the demand of goods that we had, which then led to inflation. And we've been struggling with that ever since. And so I think a lot of companies have been saying, we don't want to put all our eggs in the China basket anymore. And so you've seen some major companies like Apple, for example, and Chase, who, while they have said, yes, we do want to continue having a relationship with China, they've also been saying, perhaps we want to move some of our manufacturing into other countries like India or Bangladesh, or rely more on Europe or Mexico, or even bring stuff back to the United States. In fact, one thing that we've seen recently has been a huge increase in the investment in manufacturing facilities here in the United States. In fact, it's one of the largest increases that we've seen in years. So it shows that perhaps some of these companies are deciding, these supply chain disruptions are not the type of thing that we want to essentially get ourselves into in the future. And one way to do that is basically to reshore some of our workforce back here into the United States. Now, what's interesting is that this has been a big problem in China. China is actually facing a pretty severe economic crisis right now. They appear to be going into recession, and a big part of it is the fact that they aren't exporting the way they typically are. So much of their economy is driven by these cheap exports that they're able to ship all over the world. And the fact that most of the rest of the world now is kind of, maybe not quite so enthusiastic about it, is something that's impacting their economy dramatically. And what's funny is, while we're dealing with inflation here in the United States and in Europe, China actually is facing the potential of deflation, where prices actually might start going down. Now, you might say, oh, that's a good thing, you know, things get cheaper. But in reality, what it ends up happening is people end up not spending their money because they say that, you know, things might get cheaper going forward. And as a result of them not spending money, you don't get that economic activity that you get again from the consumers spending their money. You know, as we've talked about so many times before, the great force that keeps the United States economy moving forward so aggressively is the spending power of the American consumer, the fact that we get money and that we spend it. You know, people say, oh, that's a bad thing. But no, from an economic perspective, that's a good thing. That's what leads to the economic activity. And if you're in a country like China where people are saying, you know, oh, maybe we shouldn't spend our money, or again, what we're seeing in Germany, all of a sudden you start to see these countries get themselves into some economic problems. And again, you know, China being the #2 economy in the world, it could have an impact then on the global economy and potentially impacting us here in Michigan as well. So it's going to be interesting to see the way this whole thing develops. The good news is the American economy still appears to be very strong. We received some good, strong employment figures going forward. But by the same token, you look at the rest of the world, and it's kind of a scary place right now.
Dr. Greiner, thank you as always for joining us as we talk about the way that inflation's both impacting us here in the state of Michigan, as well as population issues, but also some of these similar issues being impactful all throughout the globe in places as far east as China and as far west as Germany. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here. Have a great weekend, Tyler.